While Catherine lights up our live, I will introduce our panels. So I'm very excited to have this awesome panel here today to provide some reflections on the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games and also looking to our Tokyo 2020 Paralympic Games, which kicks off next week. So we have Michelle, Jeff and Holly, who have all agreed to join us, bringing their different and diverse ranges of expertise and experience surrounding Olympics and some of the conversations they've had of late. And of course, Catherine Ordway as well, who I've had some very eye-opening and interesting discussions with in preparing for this panel and leading the way and providing her input too. So without further ado, I'll leave it to Catherine to take away. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Chelsea, and thank you to all the panel members for joining today and giving up your time to be part of the HDR session. It's so wonderful to have your insights and different perspectives. I wanted to kind of understand what you were feeling like in the lead up to the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games this time, because it was a very different experience for everyone, of course. And I admit that I had some mixed feelings about it. And my experience is that I have been involved in the Sydney 2000 Olympics as a lawyer, and from then just fell in love from being in that experience. Of course, my first experience was to see the Moscow Olympic Games on television as a child, and that's when my heart really went out to the Olympics. But working on it for that period was also an incredible experience. So I was really looking forward to it, but I felt some trepidation, of course, for the Japanese people. I should confess that I was part of the bid for the Istanbul Games for 2020, and the Istanbul bid lost by one vote. And I'm quite sure now the people of Turkey are glad that they didn't have to go through the horrendous experience that the Japanese people went through, particularly having their sunk cost of somewhere around $3 billion to put on the spectacle that was the Olympic Games and soon to be the Paralympic Games. So I just wondered if each of you could kind of explain how you felt going into the Olympics, and then what your level of engagement was like. What did you get into? If we can start with Michelle first.
Sure. I'd probably have to say, Catherine, much like yourself, there was that kind of competing emotion around we're in the middle of a pandemic and there was certainly a lot of discussions around the prioritisation of athletes in terms of vaccines, enabling their travel abroad when there are so many Australians that are wanting to get home to see loved ones, or equally are wanting to get back to Australia. So I think, certainly I was quite involved in sort of untangling and trying to understand that against the notion that, and I think this was certainly part of, and I don't want to say rhetoric, but that was coming out of Japan, that, this is an opportunity to think of the future and to show that with human spirit, we can overcome things like a pandemic. So I think there were those two competing discourses. So what I will say, however, is that when the games started, I must admit that I was watching it every minute that I could. And I think being that we were certainly in New South Wales in lockdown and at home, that sentiment around it being a space and place to escape, and to watch some excellence as was displayed at the Olympics, I think was really something special. But I guess also in reflection, and part of what we'll talk about is, I was still very miffed about some of what happened during the games, and vexed as well. So very mixed emotions on that front.
Yeah, we might explore some of the incidents that happened during the games in a moment. But Jeff, from a high performance perspective, how were you feeling going into the games, and did you get on board once it started?
Yeah, I was, to be honest, I was very nervous prior to it, just because I really wanted to see the athletes and coaches that I know so well, have their opportunity to compete. So like others, I'm sure I did think about what how Tokyo was going to respond to having the games, and was nervous whether it was going to go ahead or not. But probably selfishly, I was thinking more about the athletes themselves and the coaches themselves and the teams that dedicated their lives the last, 4, 5, 8 years towards that event. And so I was really just hoping that they'd get that opportunity to perform. And so once it got started, I was glued to, TV and apps and everything I could look at to try and monitor how it's going. And our whole organisation was really behind it. And, we had medal alert text going around and everything. So once it was going, it took a life of its own. And I think it was good that the coverage really had a nice balance, I think, between the performances and celebrating the athletes, but also it did show that you were constantly reminded that we're still in a pandemic and how Tokyo was dealing with it and getting through it. And so, in a way, I think it just highlighted that the world can still come together, in that significant event, but it still had that sort of somber feeling about it as well, with those empty stadiums and everything.
Yeah. Was your experience similar, Holly? How did people feel about it from a New Zealand perspective? Not expecting you to represent the entire country, of course. I wonder if it was any different.
Yeah, kia ora, Catherine. Thanks for having me today to share some of my reflections on the Olympics. I certainly can't speak on behalf of all of Aotearoa, but I think it's definitely an Olympics that we're not going to forget anytime soon. As a critical sociologist, I was definitely uncomfortable about the games going ahead. I think the games still going ahead is very revealing of the kinds of power and politics involved in the Olympic Games and the IOC and the Olympic movement. And it going ahead despite 80% of the Japanese people not wanting to go ahead and really thinking about who benefits from those games going ahead. And really it's not Tokyo and it's not Japan, it was the IOC. And but I do hear those comments around how important it was to lift the spirits of people around the world during incredibly difficult and dark times, and those are not over yet. So I had mixed emotions, definitely going into it, really concerned that it was still happening. I was not anxious, but I was very interested to see what was going to happen with the new sports. So surfing, skateboarding, sport climbing, BMX freestyle, because my colleague Belinda Wheaton and I had been studying this process for over a decade and we'd just finished a book on it. So we were very eager to see what actually happened at the games and sort of the response from global audiences as well as the communities of participants around the world. So that was really interesting to watch. And a lot of our predictions based on a decade of research came to the fore. So that was interesting to watch too. But also watching Laurel Hubbard at the games, obviously a New Zealand transgender athlete, something that we were researching in terms of the media response to that. So that was an emotional roller coaster too, as a critical feminist scholar to watch that process. But also just so many fascinating things happened in terms of gender and the policing of bodies and the incredible young athletes we saw and how athletes were using social media. And so, it's that kind of balance as a critical sociologist, keeping in mind decades of critical sociological thinking about the power and politics of the Olympics, and Professor Jules Boykoff's concept of celebratory capitalism and the relationship with the IOC, and then also looking for some glimmer of hope and light in difficult times. So I think I was a middle walker between those, the dark and light, I guess.
Well, Holly, I'm interested to hear a bit more about the process that you studied in the lead up to the games, about these new events and what your feeling was about how well they did. What in a nutshell did you find?
Yeah, so Belinda and I had been working with the IOC. We had an Olympic program research grant for a couple of years, did a big international survey, basically in the shortlisting process. And this was all very controversial in these sporting cultures because many of them were saying, we're not a sport, we don't want to go into the Olympic Games. There was a lot of concerns around losing their sort of control, their autonomy. There was lots of kind of structural changes in terms of, okay, if they're going into the Olympics, who's going to manage and run that process, all these issues of international leadership, and then that kind of trickled down to the national levels. And these were sports that some of them hadn't had these types of infrastructure and structure before. So they went through a time of great kind of structural upheaval. But in the year or two leading towards the Games, those that wanted to compete, they were committed and they wanted to be there. And I think we really saw that at the Games. They were very emotional about being there. They were very committed to the Olympic pursuit. Still, the communities around the world of these sporting participants, some of them were pretty divided about it. But I think audiences who don't know these sporting cultures or their unique kind of histories, many of them seem to not understand necessarily some of the things they were witnessing, but seem to enjoy the community of these participants who were celebrating each other's successes, there for each other, hugging, singing, particularly with the young, the skateboarders. We saw, particularly the women's skateboarding, very young podiums, 13-year-old girls, 16-year-old girls, and we knew that was coming, but we knew that was going to give the world a bit of a shake-up in terms of some of their stereotypes about who are skateboarders, and often there's that stereotype of the young teenage boy skateboarder. But we saw a lot of diversity in terms of participants, gender. We saw Alana Smith, who is a US skateboarder. They challenged sort of the gender binaries at the Olympics. So they had they, them on their skateboard, and we saw a lot of interesting ideas coming to the fore in these Olympics. And it's not that, I think it's part of a longer process of change around ideas around gender and youth and what the Olympic Games are actually about. But I think overall, the surfing, skateboarding, sport climbing, BMX was largely pretty successful in terms of global audiences seem to enjoy that youthful, creative sort of energy that they brought to the Games.
Yeah, that's fascinating insights. Thank you so much, Holly. I wonder if Michelle, you found something similar when you were looking at the Games. Were there issues that tied into your research that you want to share?
Yeah, I guess like Holly, I was really interested to look at the power and the politicking pre-Games. And I think there was a couple of things I was most interested in. And, obviously it was going into the Games, it was going to be the most gender equal. And, I think what we saw was this rhetoric around numbers. And what really concerned me is that only tells part of the story. And what I think we really saw during the Games was you just have to scratch a little bit beyond that rhetoric, and we see the stories and the multiple realities. And so I think a couple of things that I took from that was that, I kind of take issue because, they were espousing gender equality, and I think there's a fundamental difference between equality and equity, which is, I guess, what I'm pointing to in respect to the gaps between practice and values being espoused. But I think certainly leading up to the Games, there were some really big issues with the male administrators, and Japan, in a recent global report, as it relates to gender equity, was 121 of 152 nations. So we know that it's one of the most unequal societies, and to have the Games purported as the most equal, and we just fell short. Obviously, that will probably go to Paris, and in some ways, if we look at the history of the Games, Paris was the first Games where women officially competed. But yeah, I think what I took from the Games was that it was really fabulous to see that the athletes themselves were pushing against those normative kind of representations. But I'm also conscious of, and I've thought a lot about this, is the cost and the personal cost all the time. So it's in this respect, I'm talking about women, but Holly's obviously spoke to the experiences and her research around seeing how media constructs transgender athletes. It's like they've got to always be fighting tooth and nail. And, you know, there is obviously a cost in this, and we've seen some of that cost play out, particularly when we look at Simone Biles and others. But I think that's really important to be mindful of as well, and that there is almost an expectation that they be advocating and pushing for change. And I think we've got to be cautious about the expectations and the pressures that we place on those athletes. But I think it was really amazing to see the Germans wear the unitard, and very much signalling that this is what we feel comfortable in to participate. We're high performance athletes, and you know, the rules enable that. We did see, and while it was pre-games, I think certainly seeing the handballers really come out and see the discourse on social media and the support that was rendered. So I think that's really exciting, that we're seeing, you know, hopefully a changing of the guard. And then you pit that too with some of what Holly just mentioned about the youthfulness coming through. So, you know, the old white men that have controlled and been the power brokers, hopefully we're starting to see that kind of shift. But that's notwithstanding the complexities that are obviously still there. But I think we're seeing all the right signs. But as I said, I think I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'm also very cognizant of the personal cost to those athletes that have really put themselves out there. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to pick up something that Michelle was talking about, and something I haven't actually consciously put into words myself, but I felt like all the time I was watching the Olympics, there was almost this hauntings to it of who was not there. The spectators weren't there, and that was always very kind of confronting, and you kind of got used to it after a while. But also all of those athletes who had qualified but weren't there because of pandemic and the effects that had on them. And we've seen a very tragic situation in New Zealand with an athlete suspected suicide because of some of these pressures and some of these decisions that were made. But also those athletes whose bodies were policed and regulated, women's bodies with high levels of testosterone. Often those are black and brown women's bodies who were not there. So I think I was kind of watching the games, and I had some sense of joy in watching these incredible athletes, but there was always in the back of my mind this kind of haunting of these games, and that was who was not there. And there were many that weren't there in these games, not just in terms of attendance, but in terms of who makes these rules and regulations. And that still is those very powerful white men, typically sitting around the IOC executive tables, who make these decisions about who belongs and who doesn't.
That's exactly right. In fact, that's the next thing I would ask Jeff about, the sense of who was there and who can we have more athletes than male athletes so that would actually I think
Catherine, I don't know if you were asking a question there, but I couldn't hear anything that you just said. Did anyone else hear that? Yeah, your audio is chopping in and out. Sorry.
I think Chelsea was just suggesting on the chat, maybe, Catherine, if you were to jump out and then back in, it might enable the sound. It's always the way, isn't it? Technology, you have it all set up.
How about we put a question to Jeff? It sounded like she was about to put something to Jeff. Could you tell us about the environmental conditions of Japan, perhaps the heat, and how the athletes and teams were preparing for that and those considerations?
Yeah, okay, sure. We knew that Japan was going to be very hot and humid. And so there was a lot of work that's been happening over the years getting ready for that. And it was really interesting, the different water sports too, that, you know, how they were monitoring different environmental conditions. So we had some projects, for example, we had some discussions with sports like Surfing Australia, and they're talking about the different types of waves that they have in Japan and how different it would be for some of those surfers to surf those waves compared to the waves they do in their normal world, you know, competitions and stuff, and how it's almost like a different type of athlete that has to be on those sorts of waves compared to the regular waves. And so it was having implications of how they got selected and everything. So that was interesting. But the heat conditions, we knew they were going to be bad, but as you could see, a lot of countries, everyone knew it was going to be bad, but a lot of athletes did sort of really suffer from those heat, humid conditions. It was amazing to see some of the, you know, long distance athletics events and stuff like that. That it was terrible to see some of what those athletes were doing to their bodies, and amazing, you know, some of the performances that were achieved in those conditions. So we have had really hot Olympics previously, like Beijing was really hot, and in Rio and other things. So the science behind it is getting better around, you know, cooling strategies and prepping athletes for those sorts of conditions. But I don't know if anyone really thought about exactly how humid it was going to be for some of those events. And I think the other thing too was the timing of some of the events as well, and particularly for I think the timing of the events has a lot to do with, you know, TV coverage and finals and stuff like that. And so sometimes the events were being held during times that were really not that optimal to perform. It was more just better for television audiences in Northern Hemisphere. And so I thought that was a big consideration too around, yeah, what was happening in climate. Back, Catherine? Oh dear, yeah, you're completely mute. Sorry, Catherine. There are some questions in the chat. Would you like us to go through those? Michelle, you're on mute too if you would.
Cool. Sounds like we've got a couple of technical issues with Catherine, but happy to do as Jeff said and go through the questions on here. Otherwise, I'm keen to engage in just an open conversation about some more of our reflections around things like gender, Paralympics and change, like what Carlos has suggested here. What sort of changes, innovations do you think will be kept from the Tokyo experience for Paris, LA, and then Brisbane in terms of operations and logistics?
I can jump in with one of my thoughts around that. One of the things I did think that was a bit different for Tokyo, and something we're probably going to see more in Paris, LA, is the digital engagement of the Olympics and the level of ability for people to engage in different ways with the content, and particularly in the COVID environment where you can't have people in stadiums and that sort of stuff. So I think that we're on the cusp of another technology revolution where you see more, you know, augmented reality and virtual reality experiences for future games, where you'll be able to buy tickets at an event to see something at a certain angle from VR and AR and those sorts of experiences. So I thought that was really interesting, the digital exposure of the games. Can
I pick that up a little bit? I think half of my consumption of the games was via the athletes' own social media themselves and their Instagram often. And I think that's an important shift that's happening, and it's also something that the IOC has been trying to figure out how to work through this, because in a way it takes some of their power away in terms of those relationships with the big media corporations like NBC, which is, you know, those relationships are so important to the economic viability of the Olympics. So I know that the IOC have been working through some of those issues in terms of we can't stop athletes using social media. Actually, that's a really important form of engagement for our audiences and often younger audiences to the games, but we actually can't control that. And I know that the IOC was quite stressed around athletes using social media in the athlete village. They were worried about what people might see behind the scenes if they were allowed to do so. But I think this is just a new media landscape for the Olympic Games, and athletes, all of them, are doing that digital labor. They're prosumers, you know, they're producing their own media all the time, and in really interesting ways, and so doing, they're telling different stories about the games. I mean, there was a top woman skateboarder who unfortunately tested positive for COVID just for going into the event, and she documented her whole journey of basically what it was like to be in Tokyo in quarantine, which was awful. And she was showing that and sharing that, and I think we get to see behind the scenes in ways that the IOC can't always control, and that's been difficult for them to release some of that control. But definitely an interesting new media stories about the games, about the Olympic athletes and their journeys, and shifting those power dynamics.
Yeah, and I think in a related note, even just coming up to the games, the idea of athlete activism, and again we see that power and control, and there was a reaffirmation of Rule 50. But equally, I thought it was really interesting to see that, again, athletes were still within the confines and some not. I mean, there were some political gestures which we know aren't permissible under the guise of Rule 50. But I think what would be really interesting is to watch that as the games, sort of the next games, Paris, and then moving forward, is how do athletes again maneuver around and negotiate those kind of rules, if you will. But again, it very much speaks, Holly, to what you were saying about made permissible by who, and who's got control all the time. And probably the only other note, I think, you know, if you look at Caster Semenya and her not being able to defend her 800-metre gold, and the Namibian athletes who weren't allowed to compete in the 400 were allowed in the 200. I mean, I just kind of find all of that just so vexing that by virtue of naturally occurring levels of testosterone in their body, that they would be precluded in any way. So I just kind of, and as you rightly suggested, it is intersections there with race as well. I just find that really so concerning.
I've seen a couple of comments in there around transgender participation in the games, and the IOC flagging further discussions regarding the policies around transgender athletes. And I think this was the games where this was, you know, it's not the first games where we've had transgender participants, but it was definitely the games where we saw the most media engagement with these topics, obviously with Laurel Hubbard from New Zealand, her qualification, and with Quinn as part of the Canadian football team. And I think this was a very emotive topic for people. It was very polarizing. There was a lot of very negative, transphobic groups working in this space who are trying to sway the public opinion on this topic, who are trying to change decisions being made at top levels. And really what this comes down to is and it's not going away anytime soon. How sport and Olympic sport and competitive sport reinforces the gender binary, and actually, as society is parts of society are trying to move away to more fluid understandings and more complex understandings of gender. What does this mean for sport that is still organised around a gender binary? And so I know there was a lot of work going on behind the scenes with the IOC, with International Weightlifting Federation, with groups like Athlete Ally, trying to educate journalists, trying to help them use the appropriate language to avoid dead naming, to treat athletes with respect. So it was quite a teachable moment in terms of the opportunity to help people have these difficult conversations. Perhaps some people moved along in their understandings by sitting with this discomfort for a little while, reading a little bit, maybe coming to some different thinkings on this topic. But I think many others didn't know where to sit on this, or leaned into sort of gut responses, which were, this is wrong, this shouldn't be allowed, this is not the Olympics. So I do think there's a lot of work that needs to happen from here. Watching Laurel in Tokyo, I felt like the systems weren't well prepared to protect and support athletes through that process. It felt like a great big experiment at the cost for the individual. So I do hope that there's a lot of learning that can happen from this moment. And I hope the IOC gets the right people around those tables that make these decisions, and the right people are not just necessarily scientists, but also ethicists and philosophers and transgender athletes and those from the transgender community. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to happen, but this was a Games where these issues were very much front and centre for many people.
Jeff, I think there was a question here to you, and it was in relation to Mitch asked the question, with Brisbane in 2032, how do you think the funding landscape for athletes and support staff will change over the intervening period? Will more be done to support athletes who live outside of the major city environment, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have seen like a lot of interest, obviously, in what athletes are going to, how the support's going to be rolled out for the 2032 announcement. And from a state institute and academy sport point of view around the country, we've seen significant increases in budgets already. And some of it aligned to the 2032 bid, and others just because they needed an increase, to be honest. But all I can talk about is what I know from the Queensland perspective, and that is that we are rolling out a regional talent search. It has to start now. So although the 2032 seems like a long way away with 11 years to go, what we do know is that, you know, at the Rio Olympics, 75% of the medalists at the Rio Olympics were in the top 10 performers in London. And so we sort of see that as a much shorter runway than that we need to get into the top 10 by 2028, which is going to be a very difficult Olympics against in the US. So we have to be in the top 10 in LA if we want to be on the podium, give us a good chance of being on the podium in Brisbane. And while there's been a lot of talk around the infrastructure development and basically building the stage, what we're focused on is having those performers on the stage, because that's will be very memorable for many. Is if you host an event like this and then we don't have great performances, we don't want to be remembered for the wrong reason. So we really want to give everyone the best chance of success. So there are significant talent programs being rolled out across the state for Queensland, and I'm sure other states will be doing the same. And there's significant work too happening at a sort of heads of state level, I guess, where they're working together on strategies to how do we really unearth all that talent and support pathways through better coaching initiatives and structures and processes, basically to support and retain athletes in sport, and sometimes pivoting, you know, athletes to other areas as well. So yes, it is a good question, but I do think there's going to be a significant resource jump.
Thanks for your response, Jeff. We're attempting this question to get.
Shall we try? Can you hear me now? Third browser lucky. Fantastic. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry that I missed some of that because the sound was terrible coming through my end, so it was really difficult to hear you. So if I double up on anything, please just shout out. I was hoping to get your thoughts about what success looks like and whether or not we have started to shift our thinking around medals are everything. I know that we've been talking about that for a while. Australia, of course, had winning edge, but Canada had top of the podium as their high performance strategy. And I wonder whether there is a new way forward, not just into, I want to ask Michelle and Holly whether there is a world past or beyond binary sport, but is there also a world beyond medals when we're measuring success? Is it PBs, or are there other ways to measure how we should be feeling happy about our athletes and our contribution to the world of high performance? Jeff, did you want to kick off first?
Sorry, I thought that was a good question, so I was waiting for someone to jump in. But yeah, I think this debate comes up a fair bit, and there was a lot of talk around, removing medal targets, and people have removed medal targets from a lot of strategic documents and that sort of thing. But I think it's funny. One thing that I reflected on from Tokyo is that once we won the medals, suddenly everyone was quite happy to count them again. It's like, oh yeah, we did this on the medal tally, and we had a really great Olympics because of the medal performances. But I think for high performance industry, medals are of course important, but that's just the cherry on the top of the performances, really. So if an athlete has an outstanding performance, we're really proud of that, and that's what we're wanting to do. So our measure of success is, can the athletes perform when it matters? And so if the athlete can perform when it matters, and they did, and that's what matters to us. So winning a medal with a subpar performance is amazing, but having an amazing performance and not winning a medal is just as great. So I think that's sort of how I think of it personally, anyway.
So it's an individual sport and discipline definition then of what amazing is, based on that particular individual's own story. Is that playing in this aspect?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm only talking from my own personal experiences, as an athlete and working with athletes and coaches. But these people, that is their focus, is winning a medal, standing on the podium. That's their dream. And so if we can help them realize that dream, then that's our job, is trying to help them to realize that dream. I think the danger is when you start putting, if the medals start to be the deciding factor of where the resource goes, I think that's dangerous. And that's where you start to only put your funding towards things that are already successful, and so therefore they're always going to be successful, and you never give anything a leg up that needs it. Or opportunities for people to explore in areas that we could be successful. So I think that's the danger for our system, is still having this approach where you need to sort of have an athlete comes through that flukes it and gets success without having hardly any support, and therefore we all turn our attention to that, going, we should probably support that sport because we're getting some success. So I think we have to be smarter in understanding where the opportunities are for success and directing our resources towards that, rather than based on historical medal performances.
Okay, would you agree with that, Michelle? And what do you think about my question about whether there is still value in binary sport, or whether there's going to be a world beyond that?
Yeah, I guess, just if we're talking about sort of 2032 and looking to the future, just thinking about the fact that the Olympics is funded by the public purse, and while gold medals are important, I'd hope to think that there's something more that is the measure of success. And athletes are the stars, obviously, of the show. But when I think about sort of 2032, and I think about the opportunity that we have in terms of pushing the boundary, and I think certainly, as Holly's already suggested, part of that started to happen in Tokyo, and I'd probably echo her remarks there around that notion of experimentation and that cost to the individual. So I think, there needs to be thoughtfulness around what voices are heard and what lived experiences are valued. And I'm even just thinking a little bit about some of the decision-making pre the games, and just sort of thinking about the pregnant body and those women that were lactating, and the decisions that were made that completely neglected to even think about their realities and their lived experiences. And so it is, of course, possible that they would be, having to feed their child. And of course, if perhaps we had different voices and different people at the table, those decisions would look really different. So the other thing that I'm kind of thinking of, and there's a question here which relates to racism and discrimination in LA and Paris, thinking about the Australian context and thinking about a small paper that some colleagues and I wrote about reconciliation action planning and the 2018 Com Games. And that was so fantastic to see that. And I haven't heard anything about it yet, but and certainly, our friends across the ditch, New Zealand, do this far better than we do in Australia, and I think we can really learn from what they've done. But it was great to see there was a wrap and all of that sort of happened. But where's the responsibilization? And again, whose voices are at the table? So I won't sort of speak too much about, I guess, the notion of binary, in that I don't know a great deal about it. And, I don't know that my voice is best represented. But what I feel is that there's an opportunity to push the status quo and to really challenge what is rendered normal and permissible. So whatever opportunities they are, be they virtue of gender, be it race, be it sexuality, be it all those things, I sincerely hope that, notwithstanding it is about athletic performance, but this is a powerful platform. So yeah, just some sort of thoughts in my mind at this point.
Yeah. Thank you, Michelle. What do you think, Holly? Is there value still in binary sport? You've done a lot of thinking around transgender sport and DSD athletes.
Yes, I think sport is deeply entrenched in the gender binary. The history of sports basically entrenched in the gender binary. So I think thinking beyond that is very challenging for many, the majority of people probably around the world. I think we need to start moving in that direction, but I think it's a wee way off. But I think for me, these games brought to the fore these kinds of questions: is what is the future of sport? Is it more of the same, or is this a moment when we're facing pandemic and environmental crises, shifting ideas around gender? Hopefully these games brought to the fore issues of athlete well-being in a system that really does not treat them well. Maybe we need to rethink the Olympics altogether. Are we going to continue to critique them, and then during the games we park all that aside and we start feeling all the good stuff and cheering for our athletes, or do we start actually pushing back and thinking about what the future of the Olympic Games should be looking like? Is it really more mega events of athletes and teams and spectators traveling around the world on planes? They have a huge environmental, carbon footprint of these events is enormous. Is this you know, not only do we need to rethink the gender binary in sport, we probably need to rethink mega events altogether. I mean, that seems radical, but aren't we in radical times? I think we are. And for me, no matter all the successes of the New Zealand team or how much joy I might have had from moments of watching athletes achieve their lifelong dreams, there was an enormous shadow over the New Zealand Olympics with the suspected suicide of Olivia Podmore, and with all of our teams coming back from Tokyo and MIQ, and there's a huge amount of grief in our high performance sport community at the moment. And not only is it grief, but there are questions being asked around what is this all about and at what costs. And there's been a lot of work here, as there has been in Australia, around athlete wellbeing and mental health and making sure athletes have psychologists. But actually, is it only about providing support around those athletes who are struggling, or is it actually around a cultural shift that is what's going on that's pushing them off that edge? And we've had athletes who are putting their hand up and saying no more. We've had athletes walking away. We've had athletes doing incredibly extreme things because they can't survive in this environment anymore. So maybe this is a moment where actually, rather than counting up our medals, we actually need to think about whose bodies are missing, what is the future of the Olympic Games, and at what cost for our athletes.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think Chelsea's question touches on what I was thinking about too, which is if the Olympic Games is designed to achieve excellence and to push the ideas of human boundaries, then how else could we achieve those aims if we in fact think that's a valid aim to be achieved and is still a valid thing to look for? Because as you point out, from a sustainability and an environmental perspective, mega events are not within a future that we would want for ourselves, and that would apply to massive music festivals and a range of other kind of tourism events and other things, not just in sport, the way that we need to rethink. So I was wondering, heading into 32, what would we be doing then for ahead of Brisbane, that we would take the lessons from the Olympics and see how that could apply to our sports industry more generally? And I was particularly thinking about the question from Sarah Stiles, who's taken on the Victorian women's sport role, where she's saying, well, in the last 11 years, we've managed to achieve a great deal for women's sport. In the next 11 years, what might we be able to achieve? And I wonder what changes each of you think that we might be able to achieve, both from a sustainability perspective, but also from an inclusion perspective for women, for Indigenous people, for a range of people with various abilities and so on. Over to you, Jeff.
Yeah, it's a hard question for me because sometimes I'm very much like this, you know, athlete performances, coach performances, that's my job, that's what I do, you know, but I do think about these things. And I was actually watching a webinar earlier this week where it was the organising committee or the Brisbane 2032 bid people having a chat about basically what have they agreed to in this bid document. It is interesting. One of the things was that and 2032 is not going to be the first. I think Paris may be the first of having a climate positive games. And so what that actually means and how are they going to implement that? And so from an innovation perspective, I'm starting to think about how can these major events and significant events really drive innovation beyond sport. So if we're going to have a climate positive games in 2032 with zero waste and reduced emissions and that sort of thing, how can this event then improve society? How can we use that as a catalyst for innovation to really work towards that? So I think the Olympics is moving more towards that sort of thinking, but it's still very early days, and I don't know whether, and I don't know because I haven't looked, but I don't know whether there's a really structured strategy that actually sets that out, saying, okay, we want to be hitting these areas of society that need to get better. So therefore, this is the sort of programs we're going to have to, facilitate that innovation and encourage countries to do that. So it's an interesting point, though.
Yeah, well, certainly it's not even sustainability and environmental issues are not even appearing in our own national sport plan from Sport Australia. So I think there's a lot of space to do some work if you look at it as an opportunity. Holly, what do you think?
Yeah, I think we need to be really careful of Olympic rhetoric. So as part of our research with the IOC and the inclusion of these action sports, we were obviously looking at Agenda 2020, which was the big policy document, 20 items plus 20 items. It was very much about, we need to change because the world is changing. They're facing a lot of critique. What is the future of the Olympic Games? And some of this seemed like quite radical stuff. And a lot of it was around the environment and gender and, working with different partners. But through our research focus on action sports, we've argued that is basically a performance of organisational change. So we actually, in saying some things and actually in reality, the IOC hasn't really deeply unpacked a lot of the stuff that's been going on for a long time, hence the critiques. And I think the same thing around the environment. So we have these claims about, the first, environment positive games in Paris. At the same time, the deep contradiction that they're going to be hosting the surfing in Tahiti and Teopu, which is incredibly elitist. They're going to fly all the athletes back to the ceremonies. I mean, it's, the ideas that the IOC is bringing sport to the people through these informal, youthful sports, and yet they go against all these things that they're saying they are doing in one case, and then they go and do something like that. So I do think there's a lot of greenwashing going on in the Olympic rhetoric in many sports organisations. So we need to really unpack some of that and hold them to account too. But I take your point, Jeff, in terms of maybe good leadership in this space with gender as well, and the environment and actually athlete wellbeing. There is the potential for real leadership here, so other sports and events around the world can follow. But it requires deep courage from the IOC to push these forward and to hold all, to account all the way along the line. But we'll see. They haven't got a great track record.
Would you agree with that, Michelle? Has that also been your analysis?
Yeah, look, I think, progress narratives are dangerous. And, I think about, again, the calculative rationalities. We've got near parity, we've got all these things. And I feel like almost in a way that that dialogue and that kind of meaning can actually operate to kind of conceal the latent ongoing inequities. And, I think about sort of my doctoral research where I looked at how informal practices in Australian sport organisations shape men's and women's careers in equitable ways. And, we have these front-facing policies which purport all of these ideals around gender equality. And then you only have to speak, and I spoke to 60 people working in Australian sport, and it's horrifying. And it was often the case that CEOs and senior personnel really genuinely believed that, it was gender equitable and that things had changed. So, I think while we have seen some change, I won't be apologetic in saying that really have we seen that much change. And, an example I think is, say, in respect to the Tokyo Games, and we saw some structural changes which were great in terms of when men's and women's events were showcased on television and the scheduling and the like. But then we still saw particular female athletes represented in very gender normative ways. So yes, we've seen some structural change, but again, it's the culture and those practices. But something that was really sat poignantly for me, and something that I would hope will change in 11 years, is there was this great image of the Dolphin swim team, the Aussie team, near parity, and then you had 7 male coaches standing in front of that gender equal squad. Now, you can't tell me that there is not coaching talent in the women's ranks. Why is that? Because there's a cultural issue. And so, yeah, I think those progress narratives are really dangerous. And I constantly draw on those kind of exemplars to say, well, you know what? We haven't seen change. And that, to me, that image just sticks in my mind as just so representative of the issue. We've got the talent, we've got the women, and all this BS that women need to lean in and they need to put their hand up. We have been. You can speak to the women of my research, and it's just tiring, you know. And again, it's women having to fight tooth and nail, or those people that don't fit the norm. So yeah, just some emotive remarks there, but yeah, I think we've just got to be so careful. Yeah.
Well, I think it's really interesting to reflect on the questions from Adrian there about what thesis topic, what research topic would you research around this new thinking, and perhaps Sterling has made a good suggestion in his question actually, which is that we could start by doing an assessment of how well the staffing and in fact the building are doing from an inclusion and a sustainability perspective. If the International Olympic Committee is leading by example, we could have somebody do some research around how gender inclusive. I think they're fairly geopolitical inclusive. Are they age inclusive? I suspect not. Are they inclusive from an ability perspective? I'm not sure. It would be interesting to analyse certainly the new museum in terms of sustainability. So Adrian, you've got your work cut out. I think there's been a number of different topics raised here. I'm conscious of time that I think we were supposed to finish at 3:30. So I just want to ask you all for one comment each on what you're looking forward to for the Paralympics. So I'm guessing, Jeff, you might have some Paralympians heading over to Tokyo. So let us know who you're looking out for when you're going to be watching the Paralympics.
No, I definitely have some favourites, and the Paralympics is my favourite. Like, I do really enjoy watching the Paralympics. I'm a huge fan of wheelchair rugby, and so I'm really looking forward to watching that. And also obviously the swimming as well. So there's some great athletes for swimming. One thing I would like to see in future Paralympics, if we're talking also around that 2032, is for athletes with more severe disabilities having the opportunity to compete. And so we've talked about it a little bit around, you know, we've done some research projects here in Queensland with University of Queensland around athletes with severe cerebral palsy, and just the story behind these people's lives, these athletes' lives, you know, going from not being able to float in a pool to being able to swim 50 metres or 100 metres, and if they can do that, then they're probably a very high likelihood of winning a medal at an international competition like this. But then the benefits that comes to their lives by dedicating a type of therapy through sport is really amazing. And so I encourage everybody to have a look at Associate Professor Sean Tweedy's work at University of Queensland around this work that he's been doing with these athletes with severe cerebral palsy. And I hope we see more of those types of athletes competing. So it's not just athletes that, you know, not just the athletes that look a bit like our Olympians, but have a slight disability competing. I want to see a greater scope of what's possible and really see those stories come to light.
Are you of the same mind as was presented at the Four Corners program recently, that the whole classification system needs an overhaul?
I do know some people that have been working heavily in that classification area. It's a really complex issue, and there's been some incredible work. Some of the researchers in Australia are leading this internationally. So I don't know enough about it, to be honest, to comment about an overhaul. I just know that, you know, there's some brilliant minds dedicating their lives to this, and I think that we're in safe hands when we see some of those people that are working on it.
That's fantastic to hear. Thank you, Jeff. Michelle, what are you looking forward to for the Paralympics? Are you looking forward to the Paralympics?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I was only just thinking about a tweet that Dylan Alcott put out there, and he said, you know, the Olympics might be over, but hey, we've got a show ready to go. So, you know, I always love watching him, and I think about that idea of you can't be what you can't see. And so I think even just the fact that the games are together, and it would, you know, I know there's been some discussion about the intertwining of the games rather than having, while they're in situ in the same country, you know, that would be really marvelous to kind of maybe see that further integration of the two. But yeah, definitely, absolutely watching the pool and of course Murder Ball, who couldn't be watching that. So yeah, probably the three things. But yeah, I just thought that Dylan just again really speaks to that issue, and be great to see those performances.
Yeah. In fact, I think Dylan refers to the Olympic Games as the warm-up event.
Yeah.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
So maybe that's right. Holly, what about you? Are you looking forward to the Paralympics starting?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm a bit disappointed that we're not going to see surfing, the new sports, surfing, skateboarding, sport climbing. It's been pretty cool to see them at the Paralympics too, but that's not to be, despite there being incredible talent in those sports. And I'm lucky enough to work with Dr. Rob Townsend and, you know, and reading the work of David Howe, and just remind, you know, the important reminder around the elitism of the Paralympics and around broader discourses of disability sport and disability in communities. And really this is the very top pinnacle. But I guess I'm always interested in media representations and how media portrays our Paralympians. And I'm also really interested in the social media, how they tell their own stories. And social professor Kim Topoletti did some work a couple of years ago looking at female Paralympians and how they tell their own stories through social media and some of the different and similar discourses going on in their social media. So yeah, I think there's lots to look forward to, absolutely, but always keeping that kind of critical lens in terms of whose bodies, how are they represented, whose voices do we hear, same kinds of issues, I guess.
Yeah, that's fantastic to raise those issues, Holly. I'm wondering what you anticipate to see as different in terms of presentation, and both in terms of quality and quantity of media, but in terms of those other stories that you're talking about as well. What do you think will be different as we head into the Paralympics from a media perspective? Yeah,
I think there's been quite a lot of, maybe it's just my perspective and what I'm seeing or getting exposed to, but I think there's been quite a lot of work to educate those reporting on the Olympics. So educating journalists, if they're at the games, that this is the type of language that you need to be more aware of, because we know the media have played such a powerful role in shaping people's perceptions of what they see. So I think there's been quite a lot of work in that space to educate journalists to do better in terms of their, you know, fair and equitable and respectful coverage, whether it's transgender, whether it's disability sport, Paralympics, etc. So and non-binary. So I think we're seeing, it's not all great out there, but I think we're seeing some work happening in that space and some leadership happening in that space from different you know, community groups as well as from the IOC, etc. So hopefully we're going to continue to see more progress in that area in terms of representation.
Yeah, well, that's certainly a very good line for us to end up on, I think. I think that's the overarching message from this panel, is that we all hope to see greater progress and improvement as we move into our games. So we have to put up with 2 other games before ours before we can get to the important one, which is in Brisbane. in Paris and LA. No, I'm joking. But I think it's wonderful to have had the opportunity to hear from you all and to hear your different perspectives. It's been terrific because you've all got really different ideas and different life experiences and research experiences in this space. So thank you so much for sharing your time and your ideas. Let's move forward, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Over to you, Chelsea.
Cool, we're on. Thank you so much, Catherine, for facilitating this session and the work you've put into having this. I think there's been some important areas raised and things to think about, and important to acknowledge while we are taking steps forward. They're only small steps in this bigger journey that we're on in terms of equity across all areas, whether that's women, whether that's race, or Paralympics as well, and ensuring that they're in equitable games too. And hopefully one day see the inclusion of our more youthful fun sports that have been introduced to the Olympics. I think that's a great point to raise too. So thank you as well to Holly, Jeff and Michelle. Great discussion, really insightful perspectives, and great to have a range of opinions and viewpoints as well. I think that's what makes our industry so fascinating and exciting to be a part of. So thank you for all of your time today, and to everyone in the SMANS, Cauthy and Ansell's community. Thanks for joining us for the mid-year HDR conference. Hopefully you all got something out of it, got to connect with some other academics today too. And we look forward to seeing, at least for SMANS, at the end of year, hopefully Canberra conference.
Yes.
That can make it.
Yes, come to Canberra if we can. If the borders are open, everyone is welcome. If not, we'll see you online.
Excellent. So looking forward to that, and there will be some more communications about HDR Hour to come as well to round out the rest of our calendar year. So stay safe, everybody, wherever you are. Look after yourselves. Get outside and exercise where you can. And look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you all.
Bye.